Hello, we are reading Act 2, Scene 3. It is night a few weeks later. Everyone is in bed. There is complete quiet. In the Van Don's room, a match flares up for a moment and then is quickly put out. Mr. Van Don, in bare feet, dressed in underwear and trousers, is dimly seen coming stealthily down the stairs and into the main room where Mr. and Mrs. Frank and Margot are sleeping. He goes to the food safe and again lights a match. Then he cautiously opens the safe, taking out a half loaf of bread. As he closes the safe, it creaks. He stands, rigid. Mrs. Frank sits up in bed. She sees him. Otto! Otto! Come quickly! The rest of the people wake, hurriedly getting up. And then we see Mr. Frank here say in German, "What's happening? What happened?" Dussel, followed by Anne, comes from his room as she rushes over to Mr. Van Don. And then she replies in German, "He's stealing the food." You, give me that. Pooty, what is it? You dirty thief, stealing food. You good for nothing. Mr. Dussel, for God's sake, help me, Peter. Peter comes over, trying with Mr. Frank to separate the two struggling men. Let him go! Let go! Dussel drops Mr. Van, pushing him away. He shows them the end of a loaf of bread that he has taken from Van Don. You greedy, selfish. Margot turns on the light. Pooty, what is it? All of Mrs. Frank's gentleness, her self-control is gone. She is outraged, in a frenzy of indignation. The bread! He was stealing the bread! It was you, and all the time we thought it was the rats. Mr. Van Don, how could you? I'm hungry. We're all hungry. I see the children getting thinner and thinner. Your own son, Peter. I've heard him moan in his sleep, he's so hungry. And you come in the night and steal food that should go to them, to the children. He needs more food than the rest of us. He's used to more. He's a big man. Mr. Van Don breaks away, going over and sitting on the couch. And you're worse than he is. You're a mother, and yet you sacrifice your child to this man? This, Edith. Margot picks up the pink woolen stole, putting it over her mother's shoulders. Don't think I haven't seen you, always saving the choicest bits for him. I've watched you day after day, and I've held my tongue. But not any longer, not after this. Now I want him to go. I want him to get out of here. Edith, get out of here. What do you mean? Just that. Take your things and get out. You're speaking in anger. You cannot mean what you are saying. I mean exactly that. Mrs. Van Don takes a cover from the Frank's bed, pulling it about her. For 2 long years we have lived here, side by side. We have respected each other's rights. We have managed to live in peace. Are we now going to throw it all away? I know this will never happen again, will it, Mr. Van Don? No. He steals once, he'll steal again. Mr. Van Don, holding his stomach, starts for the bathroom. Anne puts her arms around him, helping him up the step. Edith, please, let us be calm. We'll all go to our rooms, and afterwards we'll sit down quietly and talk this out. We'll find some way. No more talk. I want them to leave. You'd put us out on the streets? There are other hiding places. A cellar? A closet? I know, and we have no money left even to pay for that. I'll give you money. Out of my own pocket, I'll give it gladly. She gets her purse from a shelf and comes back with it. Mr. Frank, you told Putty you'd never forget what he'd done for you when you came to Amsterdam. You said you could never repay him, that you... If my husband had any obligation to you, he's paid it over and over. Edith, I've never seen you like this before. I don't know you. I should have spoken out long ago. You can't be nice to some people. There would have been plenty for all of us if you hadn't come in here. We don't need the Nazis to destroy us. We're destroying ourselves. He sits down with his head in his hands. Mrs. Frank goes to Mrs. Van Don, giving Mrs. Van Don some money. Give this to me. She'll find you a place. Mother, you're not putting Peter out. Peter hasn't done anything. He'll stay, of course. When I say I must protect the children, I mean Peter, too. Peter rises from the steps where he has been sitting. I'd have to go if Father goes. Mr. Vandon comes from the bathroom. Mrs. Vandon hurries to him and takes him to the couch. Then she gets water from the sink to bathe his face. He's no father to you. That man, he doesn't know what it is to be a father. I wouldn't feel right. I couldn't stay. Very well then. I'm sorry. No, Peter, no. Peter goes into his room, closing the door after him. Anne turns back to her mother, crying. I don't care about the food. They can have mine. I don't want it. Only don't send them away. It'll be daylight soon. They'll be caught. Please, Mother. They're not going now. They'll stay here until Meep finds them a place. But one thing I insist on, he must never come down here again. He must never come to this room where the food is stored. We'll divide what we have, an equal share for each. Dussel hurries over to get a sack of potatoes from the food safe. Mrs. Frank goes on to Mrs. Vandon. You can cook it here and take it up to him. Dussel brings the sack of potatoes back to the center table. Oh, no, no, we haven't sunk so far that we're going to fight over a handful of rotten potatoes. Dividing the potatoes into piles. Mrs. Frank, Mr. Frank, Margot, Anne, Peter, Mrs. Vandon, Mr. Vandon, myself, Mrs. Frank. The buzzer sounds a Meep signal. It's Meep! He hurries over, getting his overcoat and putting it on. At this hour, it is trouble. As he starts down to unbolt the door. I beg you, don't let her see a thing like this. Anne, Peter, Mrs. Vandon, Mr. Vandon, myself. Stop it! Stop it! Mr. Frank, Margot, Anne, Peter, Mrs. Vandon, Mr. Vandon, myself, Mrs. Frank. You're keeping the big ones for yourself. All the big ones. Look at the size of that and that. Dussel continues on with his dividing. Peter, with his shirt and trousers on, comes from his room. Stop it! Stop it! We hear Meep's excited voice speaking to Mr. Frank below. Mr. Frank! The most wonderful news! The invasion has begun! Go on! Tell them! Tell them! Meep comes running up the steps ahead of Mr. Frank. She has a man's raincoat on over her nightclothes and a bunch of orange-colored flowers in her hand. Did you hear that, everybody? Did you hear what I said? The invasion has begun! The invasion! They all stare at Meep, unable to grasp what she is telling them. Peter is the first to recover his wits. Where? When? When, Meep? It began early this morning. As she talks on, the realization of what she has said begins to dawn on them. Everyone goes crazy. A wild demonstration takes place. Mrs. Frank hugs Mr. Vandon. Oh, Mr. Vandon, did you hear that? Dussel embraces Mrs. Vandon. Peter grabs a frying pan and parades around the room, beating on it, singing the Dutch national anthem. Anne and Margot follow him, singing, weaving in and out among the excited grown-ups. Margot breaks away to take the flowers from Meep and distribute them to everyone. While this pandemonium is going on, Mrs. Frank tries to make herself heard above the excitement. How do you know? The radio, the BBC, they said they landed on the coast of Normandy. The British? British, Americans, French, Dutch, Poles, Norwegians, all of them. More than 4,000 ships. Churchill spoke in General Eisenhower. D-Day, they call it. Thank God it's come. At last. I'm going to tell Mr. Kraler this'll be better than any blood transfusion. What part of Normandy did they land? Did they say? Normandy, that's all I know now. I'll be up in the minute I hear some more news. What did I tell you? What did I tell you? Mrs. Frank indicates that he has forgotten to bolt the door after Meep. He hurries down the steps. Mr. Vandon, sitting on the couch, suddenly breaks into a convulsive sob. Everybody looks at him, bewildered. Pooty, what is it? What happened? Please, I'm so ashamed. Mr. Frank comes back up the steps. Oh, for God's sake. Don't, Pooty. It doesn't matter now. Didn't you hear what Meep said? The invasion has come. We're going to be liberated. This is a time to celebrate. He embraces Mrs. Frank and then hurries to the cupboard and gets the cognac in a glass. To steal bread from children. We've all done things that we're ashamed of. Look at me, the way I've treated Mother. So mean and horrid to her? No, Anarchy, no. Anne runs to her mother, putting her arms around her. Oh, Mother, I was awful. Not like me. No one is as bad as me. Stop it now. Let's be happy. Giving Mr. Van Don a glass of cognac. Here, here, schnapps, Lacham. Van Don takes the cognac. They all watch him. He gives them a feeble smile. Anne puts up her fingers in a V for victory sign. As Van Don gives an answering V sign, they are startled to hear a loud sob from behind them. It is Mrs. Frank, stricken with remorse. She is sitting on the other side of the room. When I think of the terrible things I said... Mr. Frank, Anne, and Margot hurried to her, trying to comfort her. Mr. Van Don brings her his glass of cognac. No, no, you were right. That I should speak that way to you? Our friends? Our guest? She starts to cry again. Stop it. You're spoiling the whole invasion. As they are comforting her, the lights dim out. The curtain falls. Then we hear Anne's voice, faintly at first and then with growing strength. We're all in much better spirits these days. There's still excellent news of the invasion. The best part about it is that I have a feeling that friends are coming. Who knows? Maybe I'll be back in school by fall. Haha, the joke is on us. The warehouse man doesn't know a thing, and we are paying him all that money. Wednesday, the 2nd of July, 1944. The invasion seems temporarily to be bogged down. Mr. Krahler has to have an operation, which looks bad. The Gestapo has found the radio that was stolen. Mr. Dussel says they'll trace it back to the thief, and then it's just a matter of time till they get to us. Everyone is low. Even poor Pym can't raise their spirits. I have often been downcast myself, but never in despair. I can shake off everything if I write, but... And that is the great question. Will I ever be able to write well? I want to so much, and I want to go on living even after my death. Another birthday has gone by, so now I am 15. Already I know what I want. I have a goal, an opinion.